A shuttered TAFE workshop. Adelaide, 2005, late afternoon. Through the high windows, dust motes hang in the slanted light. The fluorescent tubes are switched off. The smell of cutting oil and stale carbide. The faint chalk outline on the floor where the chip tray used to sit. A dust sheet over a cast iron lathe. 250 kilograms of green-painted Australian iron. Bolted to a concrete floor with 4 3/4-inch bolts, the handwheel cold. The bed, scarred from 50 years of practice, cuts on mild steel and brass and tool steel. A generation of apprentices have left their first thread on this carriage. Pull the sheet back. A Hercus 9-inch swing V-bed lathe. Built in Thebarton, Adelaide. Crowhurst green paint, faded to the colour of the gum trees outside. The serial plate stamped with a number from Collector Mail's register. Cast in the same foundry that made the lathes that armed Australia in 1941. A handwritten paper tag on the tailstock. Auction lot, $300. The lathe a generation learned on, sold off for the price of a weekend. 23,000 of these were built in Australia. 700 are still teaching in classrooms. 0 are still being made. Australia killed a lathe. Australia could not have done without. Chapter 1. The Apprentice from Duncan and Fraser. Adelaide, 1906. The new Duncan and Fraser carriage works. Duncan and Fraser are the great carriage and tram builders of South Australia. The biggest coach works south of the equator. They build horse-drawn omnibuses for Adelaide, tramcars for Sydney, funeral carriages for the colonial gentry. Within 10 years, they will be building the first Australian-made motorcar bodies for Ford and General Motors. Inside this new factory, a young apprentice machinist takes 3 photographs. Frederick William Hercus. He is in his early 20s. The Duncan family staff register, which still exists, records him. Fred Hercus started his life as an apprentice machinist, highly motivated, an exceptional tradesman. Fred keeps those photographs the rest of his life, donates them back to the Duncan family decades later. He leaves Duncan and Fraser in the early 1920s. He has no patent, no capital, no rich father. He has skills and the photographs of a factory floor he once swept clean. One morning in May 1920, Fred Hercus walks into a small building on Payneham Road, St. Peter's, in inner East Adelaide, and opens a machining business. He names it F.W. Hercus. He is its only employee. Read that again. One morning in May 1920, the address has been verified. The month has been verified. The day of the month has not survived in any digitised Australian record. Neither has Fred Hercus's birth date. Neither has his death date. The man who would build the lathe that armed and taught a nation has today no findable headstone online. The South Australian cemetery indices have been searched. Trove has been searched. The National Library catalogue holds a 1970 booklet, the Hercus 50 Yearbook, 1920 to 1970, which presumably names dates, but it has not been digitised. Fred Hercus was alive in 1954. He wrote to the British Model Engineering Press that year, observing that an equally good South Bend copy could be bought in Australia for 10 weeks' wages, 16 weeks in England. He was a prominent early member of the South Australian Society of Model and Experimental Engineers, SASMEE, whose first meeting was held in 1927. He built a private 5-inch gauge railway through the Adelaide foothills. It is still visible from the New Norton Summit Road. He personally hand-built 5-inch gauge locomotives that ran on it. One of them was still running on Society Open Days in the early 21st century. The man who built the railway has no findable death date. The locomotives outlived their builder by an indeterminate margin, in an undocumented gap, in a country that didn't keep the records. Chapter 2. The Depression Forge. Adelaide, the 1920s. By 1925, Fred Hercus is exhibiting at the Adelaide exhibition. Small machines, bench drills, a 3.5-inch lathe, a hobbyist size, the kind a model engineer would want at home. Demand exists. By 1926, he has moved to Chapel Street, Norwood. The little 3.5-inch lathe stays in production until 1939. Over 700 are built. The seed catalogue of an Australian machine tool maker. Then the world breaks. 1929. Wall Street collapses. Within 18 months, Adelaide has unemployment at over 30%. Factories close along the Port Road. The South Australian government goes into receivership. Premier Hill, Labor, is replaced by Premier Butler, Liberal, who borrows from the British. Adelaide families queue at the Salvation Army Hostel on Light Square. The Holden body works at Woodville cuts shifts. The Islington Railway workshops put apprentices on half pay. Fred Hercus does not close. He goes to job work. Butcher's bandsaw blades, sausage mincing equipment, flywheels for stationary engines, ring gears for the new Holden bodies coming out of Woodville, repair lathes for the railway workshops at Islington, ploughshares and disc harrow bearings for the York Peninsula wheat country. Anything with a chuck. Anything that pays a wage. He keeps the lights on. He keeps the tool room warm. He keeps the apprentices. By 1936, the economy has loosened just enough. Wheat prices have recovered. Holden is shipping more bodies. Fred Hercus goes back to building machine tools. 3 years later, in 1939, he moves the works to Anderson Street, Southwark, today called Thebarton, and incorporates the firm as F.W. Hercus Proprietary Limited. The partner is McPherson's, the Melbourne wholesale ironmongers, who handle distribution into the eastern states. Anderson Street is a street of foundries. Adelaide's industrial belt. Brewery to the north, gasworks to the east, the slaughterhouse to the south. The Thebarton railway siding can take goods wagons direct from the works to the outer harbour docks. It is the right place for what is about to be asked of it. Then comes the Second War. In June 1940, 1 month after Germany invades France, the Commonwealth of Australia creates the Department of Munitions. Within it, the Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges. The Directorate is run by Frederick G. Thorpe, mechanical and electrical engineer. Thorpe and his directorate inherit a problem. Australia has gone to war on the other side of the world. The American supply chain for machine tools is being requisitioned for the United States' own factories. Britain's tool production is bombing disrupted. Australia must arm itself. Australia must build the machines that build the weapons. Australia has 18 months to find a national lathe. The phone rings in Anderson Street, Southwark. Chapter 3. The War Request. Thebarton, Adelaide, 1939. The Anderson Street Works. A senior member of the Hercus family later told the story. To a collector who runs the Australian Metalworking Hobbyist Forum. Mal, first name only, in keeping with the trade. Verbatim. At a request from the Australian War Department, they were asked to produce a machine along the line of the South Bend 9-inch for the small arms factories. This they did with amazing success and supplied the vast majority of these type of machines for the Australian war effort, and also supplied surplus to our allies throughout World War II. Now, I have to be honest about something. The lathe Hercus built was not Hercus' design. It was a copy of an American lathe. The South Bend 9-inch workshop lathe, built at South Bend, Indiana, by the South Bend Lathe Works, from the 1890s. The most copied small lathe in industrial history. 22 makers worldwide built versions of it. Boxford, Smart & Brown, Ace in England. Hercus, Sheraton, Purcell, Parkinson in Australia. Why no licence? Why no patent dispute? Why was an Australian firm allowed to mass-produce a near-identical copy of an American machine? Fred Hercus's son, Peter F. Hercus, gave the answer years later in a Model Engineering Society talk. Verbatim, you can't patent a lathe as such. The headstock geometry, the bed casting, the screw-cutting gear train. These are all in the public domain. Patents protect specific mechanisms, not architectures. South Bend had built a great architecture. Hercus copied it and made it Australian. The Australian War Department did not care about pride of design. The War Department cared about output. Output came under the direction of the Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges. Hercus produced in excess of 2,300 machines during the war years. 9-inch V-bed lathes, number 4 floor drilling machines, 6-inch power hacksaws, a range of grinding machines, the entire small machine inventory of the munitions floor. Where did they go? Across Australia. The Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory in Adelaide, the Finsbury Cartridge Case Works, built from June 1940. The General Motors Holden's plant at Woodville, which ran a separate munitions workshop in the chapel rooms of St Peter's College. The Maribyrnong Munitions Works in Melbourne, where Ford Geelong sea mine castings were filled with TNT. Some went to Allied factories overseas in the surplus arrangement, the records of which specific Hercus serial numbers went where do not appear to have survived. Confessional. Australia did not invent the lathe that armed it. Australia copied a South Bend pattern from Indiana in 1939 at the request of its own War Department and built it well enough to arm the Pacific. The first Australian sovereignty was not engineering. It was capability, and capability could be copied. Chapter 4. The Lathe, a nation learned on Anderson Street, Thebarton, the 1950s. The war ends in 1945. The foundries do not go cold. The toolrooms do not close. Fred Hercus's wartime apprentices are now journeymen, foremen, supervisors. The Hendon Ammunition Works in Adelaide wins down its peak workforce. Many of the women who turned shells through the war years are sent home. Many of the men move into the post-war factory belt. The 9-inch V-bed has a new market, 2 new markets in fact. The first is industry. Every fitter and turner shop in Australia in the post-war boom wants a small bench lathe. The Holden plant at Woodville, building the new 48-215, the FX, from 1948. The South Australian Railways at Islington. The Whyalla shipyards, riveting tankers for BHP, boat builders in Hobart. Country workshops from Mount Gambier to Townsville. Every garage with a sign on the door. Every farm with a milking machine and a need to turn a replacement shaft. The second market is education. Hercus splits the 9-inch into a model line. Model A, screw-cutting gearbox, power cross-feed, the full-spec version. Model B, change wheels, power cross-feed. Model C, change wheels, hand cross-feed, the cheapest variant. And then a fourth model that exists nowhere else in the world. Model D, built, in Tony Griffiths' words on lathes.co.uk at the behest of the Australian educational establishment. Twin lead screws, positive clutch power feed apron, designed specifically for the way Australian apprentices were taught to turn metal. The Department of Education in every Australian state buys hundreds of them. State serial sequences appear on the spindle. A UL 12728, a UL 12729. The Hercus 9-inch becomes the standard machine in Adelaide Technical College, Sydney Tech, the Melbourne School of Mines, the Brisbane Trades Hall night classes, every metropolitan TAFE that did not yet bear the TAFE name. Defence Force trade schools, the Navy Apprenticeship School at HMAS Narimba, and the RAAF trade schools all buy them. Country high schools buy them too. Metalwork rooms in Wagga, in Bendigo, in Mackay, in Geraldton, in Launceston. A whole generation of Australian boys cut their first thread on a Hercus 9-inch. The thread was almost always 1BA or 1/8-inch Whitworth. The instructor stood behind them at the carriage. The smell of cutting oil and sweat. The flat stick suspended from a nail by the chip pan used to push the swarf away from the chuck. Forum testimony, still readable on metalwork forums today, runs to thousands of threads. I haven't used a Hercus since I was in high school, 1975. Dad had one in his shed. I learned to cut threads on it at 12. School sold off 10 of them, $300 each. The Australian apprentice fitter turner of the post-war generation has Hercus in his hands, the way the American kid has a Schwinn bicycle. And in the early 1960s, the strangest export of all, Hercus shipped a batch of cream-painted Model A lathes back to South Bend, Indiana, to the company whose lathe Hercus had copied, Camlock Spindles, Lever Collet Closer, the works. South Bend bought them and sold them under its own name to American shops. The student had become a supplier. The lathe a nation learned on was also the lathe an American factory bought from an Adelaide foundry. Chapter 5. The Pinnacle. Hercus, Anderson Street, Thebarton, 1967. The Industry Update Centenary History, written in 2020, sets the year on the record. Verbatim. To this day, some see the 1960s as the pinnacle for manufacturing at Hercus, as well as for Australia. 199 staff on the books, the largest workforce in the firm's history before or since. Exports running at about 10% of sales, Asia, North America, the cream Model A batch back to South Bend. The 10,000th 9-inch lathe rolls off the line at some point in this decade. The exact day, like Fred Hercus's death date, does not appear to have survived. In a photograph from this period, John Leask is standing at the carriage of a 9-inch Model A. Tony Griffiths, on lathes.co.uk, captions it. The operator is John Leask, who worked at Hercus for almost 50 years. Almost 50 years. Read that again. Almost 50 years. A man whose working life began before the war and ended after the Hawke government, whose hands knew every variation of the spindle bearing, whose name appears on the inspection sheets for thousands of lathes that are still cutting metal in Australian classrooms today. A colleague, R.G. Excel, also worked there decades. Excel was a serious model engineer, a qualified amateur boiler inspector, and signed many of the surviving inspection sheets. His signature, faded now, is on the badge plates of restored Hercus lathes from Cairns to Perth. The Thebarton workforce reflected the Adelaide migrant story. Italians who had come on assisted passage after 1948, Greeks from Kalymnos, Yugoslavs from the Dalmatian coast, Maltese fitters, Vietnamese arriving from the late 1970s. The same Adelaide industrial belt, Hendon, Cheltenham, Croydon, Mile End, that housed General Motors Holden's Woodville workforce. Children of the Pacific War diaspora, building the lathes that would teach the children of the next diaspora to turn metal. By 1967, the South Bend pattern Australia had copied to survive the war had been refined, exported and embedded in every state's training system. The cast-iron green machine that taught the country had become, in every way that mattered, an Australian object. 21 years later, Australia would, with full bipartisan support, vote unilaterally to remove its protection. Hit subscribe before we go further. The next chapter is the one most Australian manufacturing documentaries refuse to make, because the villain is not in Detroit or Dearborn or Tokyo. The villain is in Canberra. Chapter 6, The 260 and the CNC gamble that wasn't funded. Thebarton, Adelaide, 1974. Hercus introduces a new flagship, the Hercus 260 Centre lathe, 10-inch swing, 26 mm, 1 inch passes through the spindle bore. Hence the name. Same year, Hercus purchases its first numerically controlled machine, a Maxon CNC, for its own toolroom. The intention is to learn the technology, then build Australian versions of it. The 260 is a slightly disguised continuation of the South Bend lineage. Tony Griffiths on lathes.co.uk, the tailstocks and top slides retain a charmingly original South Bend appearance. belt drive Model A and B versions, a more expensive 9-speed geared head version called the 260G, taper roller bearing spindle. The 260G is the most refined small lathe ever built in Australia. How many were made? The company says about 7,000. Collector Mal, citing Hercus manager Steve Durden, says about 8,000. Total Hercus output across all models is around 22 to 23,000 machines. By the mid-1980s, the firm is trying to make the CNC leap. The HNL lathe, the CompuTurn, the CompuMill, Australian-designed, Australian-built, numerically controlled machine tools. The CompuTurn was developed as a small training CNC for the TAFE market, recognising that the next generation of apprentices would need to learn programming as well as turning. The CompuMill was its milling counterpart. The technical work is good. The capital is not. Mazak in Nagoya, founded in 1919, is by this point the largest computer-controlled metal-cutting machine tool maker in the world. Morisaki in Japan and Gildemeister in Germany are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on CNC research. Mazak alone is building thousands of machines a year. Hercus has the entire Australian market, fewer than 200 employees, and a single Maxon in the tool room. The mathematics is brutal. A new CNC controller costs more to develop than Hercus's annual turnover. The Japanese makers are amortizing controller R&D across tens of thousands of machines a year. Hercus would be amortizing it across hundreds. The unit cost cannot be matched. The only way Hercus's CNC products survive is if the imported alternatives are priced higher, which is to say, only if the tariff wall stays in place. In late 1987, the Durden Group, Melbourne woodworking machinery makers since the late 1940s, injects capital. Steve Durden becomes the operational manager. Interest rates in Australia are climbing sharply, on their way to 18% within 2 years. Redundant plant is disposed of. The CompuMill program is wound back. The CNC dream is downgraded to keeping the lights on. This is the honest part. Hercus did not match Mazak, could not match Mazak. Australia did not have the capital base, the export volume or the supply chain to build a globally competitive CNC industry from a single firm in Thebarton. But Australia did have a tariff wall, 35% on imported machine tools. That tariff wall was the only thing keeping the Hercus workforce employed. It would survive the Whitlam cuts of 1973. It would survive the Fraser years. It would not survive what was coming on a Wednesday in May. 23,000 built, 700 still teaching. The countdown to zero had begun. Chapter 7. Wednesday, 25th May 1988, Parliament House, Canberra. Wednesday, 25th of May 1988, the Senate Chamber. Senator John Button rises to deliver an Industry Measures ministerial statement. Minister for Industry and Commerce since 1983. 5 years in the portfolio, longer than any predecessor. Button is 54 years old that morning. Born Ballarat, 30th of June 1933, Presbyterian minister's son. His father, Reverend Norman Button, served as moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Victoria in 1941 and 42 and died unexpectedly during Button's final year of school. Hume Robertson Scholarship to Geelong College, a boarding scholarship for ministers' sons, editor of the school newspaper. A debating club member in a school of Liberal supporters who insisted on advocating in print for the Chifley Labor government. Law at Melbourne. Maurice Blackburn, solicitor specialising in workers' compensation. Senator for Victoria since 1974. The man who told Bill Hayden on a February morning in 1983 that he had to stand aside and let Bob Hawke lead Labor to the election. The Australian dollar that morning is trading at 79 United States cents, recovered from the mid-80s Banana Republic crisis lows of 60 cents, but still well short of any historic strength. Button announces the economic statement that has been agreed between himself, Treasurer Paul Keating, and Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Across-the-board manufacturing tariffs to be phased down. Most categories from 35% to 15% by 1992. A unified 5% rate to be the long-term target. The statement also cuts business taxes, reduces government spending, withdraws assistance to the rural sector, and deregulates telecommunications. It is the largest single tariff reduction announced in Australia since Gough Whitlam's 25% across-the-board cut of July 1973. Now, I have to be honest about something. This was not a Detroit decision. This was not a Dearborn decision. This was not a Tokyo decision. This was an Australian Cabinet decision, announced by an Australian minister in an Australian Senate under an Australian Labor government on a Wednesday in May in the bicentennial year. Bipartisan support followed. The Liberal Party opposition, particularly John Howard, chose not to mindlessly block the Hawke reforms. Howard would, in 1996 as Prime Minister, finalise what the Hawke-Keating-Button government had begun. By 2001, the long arc had moved tariff protection from 35% in the early 1970s to 5%. The Whitlam cuts of July 1973 started the slope. The Button cuts of May 1988 made it irreversible. The Keating extension of 12 March 1991, building a competitive Australia, finished the structural job by phasing the unified 5% rate to 1996. The Howard government polished it through to 2001. Canberra disarmed Australian manufacturing. The argument was, and is, defensible on its own terms. Open economies grow faster. Tariffs subsidise inefficient firms. Consumers benefit from cheaper imports. The Productivity Commission has the numbers. Andrew Leigh has written the history. Hawke himself argued in a 1984 speech in Tokyo that Australia's future was becoming more enmeshed with Asia. Keating took the view that protectionism had made Australian industry uncompetitive by design. But the consequence for the Thebarton works was direct. The tariff wall that had let Hercus survive the post-war years without matching Mazak capital, without matching Morris Seiki capital, without matching Gildemeister capital. That tariff wall came down between 1988 and 2001. 12 years. Hercus had 12 years to find another business model. 3 years after Button's announcement, the recession Australia had to have arrived. Interest rates in the high teens, manufacturing investment frozen. Hercus's CNC programs were further pared back. The Durden Group was managing a wind down even as it tried to launch new products. The product would not survive the 12 years. Australia killed a lathe. Australia could not have done without. Chapter 8. The Pipeline Collapses. Australia, 1990. The peak year of the Australian apprenticeship system. The National Centre for Vocational Education Research Records. Verbatim. Apprenticeship numbers grew rapidly in the late 1980s to reach a peak of 161,000 in 1990. This number, together with just less than 12,000 traineeships, made 1990 the highest year on record. Read that again. 161,000 apprentices in 1990. Then the recession of 1991 hits, the recession we had to have. Apprentice numbers collapse. Through the 1990s and the 2000s, three structural forces compound the fall. 1. Corporatisation. State-owned business enterprises that had trained thousands of metal apprentices each year, the State Rail Workshops at Chullora, the Victorian Railways at Newport, the SA Railways at Islington are corporatised, then privatised, then closed. The Chullora workshops in New South Wales alone had turned out hundreds of trained apprentices a year. The withdrawal of all levels of government from apprentice training accounted for about 1/3 of the total decline. In New South Wales, the government business enterprise share of metal apprentice training fell about 80% between the mid-80s and the late 90s. 2. The Dawkins reforms, Minister for Employment, Education and Training. John Dawkins, under Hawke, restructures the tertiary sector. Colleges of advanced education become universities. Funding flows toward degrees and away from trades. The phrase knowledge economy enters cabinet language. Australian fathers are now actively discouraged from telling their sons to go for an apprenticeship. 3. The high school metalwork shop. Through the 1990s and 2000s, state education departments quietly close hundreds of school metalwork rooms. The Hercus 9-inch lathes in their Crowhurst green paint are wheeled out the back, sold at auction. $300 each in lots of 10. A forum thread on metalwork forums in the early 2000s records the going rate. The teacher who supervised the metalwork shop becomes a maths teacher. The tool room becomes a computer lab. The apprentice who would have learned to cut a thread on a Hercus goes to TAFE if the TAFE still has the workshop, or to university, or to nothing. Metal manufacturing alone contributed 31.5% of the total Australian apprenticeship decline. The country was not going to need fitter turners on the scale that Hercus had supplied since 1945. The lathe a nation learned on. The nation was no longer learning on it. Chapter 9. The imports arrive. As consequence, not cause. Sydney Redfern. Established 1930. Hare & Forbes is a second-hand machinery dealer when Tom Hare opens the doors in 1930. By the early 1960s, under Tom Hare's 4 sons, Hare & Forbes has shifted into something different. They are now importing new equipment, from Taiwan mostly in those early years. South Bend pattern lathes built in Taichung or Tainan to a fraction of the Australian price. In 2000, Hare & Forbes rebrands as Machinery House, the retail face of the import ship. Today, the firm carries more than 30 international agencies: Taiwan, China, Korea, Japan, Germany. Their school and TAFE catalogue is a substantial part of their business. The exact same TAFE colleges that bought Hercus 9-inch Model D lathes from Thebarton in 1960 are now buying Sieg, Optimum and Birmingham machines from Hare & Forbes in Sydney and Melbourne. The bigger guns are Japanese. Yamazaki Mazak, founded in 1919 in Nagoya by Sadakichi Yamazaki. By the time Hercus is winding down in the late 1990s, Mazak is the world's largest producer of computer-controlled metal cutting machine tools. DMG Mori formed when Germany's Gildemeister and Japan's Mori Seiki announced their alliance on the 1st of October 2009. Okuma, founded in 1898, and the American interloper Haas Automation, founded by Gene Haas in 1983. Collector Mal, writing on the Practical Machinist Forum, summarises the Australian situation in one line. Hercus today cannot profitably produce machine tools due to the obvious flood of Asian machinery. The obvious flood. Read that again. Obvious. Because it followed obviously from the policy decision, the imports did not invade. The imports walked through a door Canberra opened on a Wednesday in May. The tariff wall that had kept Hare & Forbes a second-hand dealer in 1960 had been removed in stages by 2001. There was no remaining barrier to a Taiwanese-built South Bend copy landing at Port Botany at 1/3 the Australian price. The honest part, and here the script must be plain. The imports are not the villain. The imports are the consequence. The villain is the policy that let them flood in. And the final irony, which the script will deliver and not flinch from. Hercus Proprietary, limited today at Regency Park, runs a Mazak Integrex i400S AG multitasking machine, the Japanese flagship that displaced the Australian flagship. The killer's machine now does Hercus's work. We chose this. Chapter 10. The last one made for South Bend, the Barton Works, 2001. The last Australian-built Hercus lathe comes off the line. Serial number GS26-075. A 10-inch swing machine, built to specifications that are an almost exact copy of the Hercus 260. The customer is South Bend Lathe Works, Indiana. Read that again. South Bend, Indiana. The same firm whose 9-inch pattern Hercus copied at the request of the Australian War Department in 1939. Collector Mal puts the recursion plain. Verbatim. So we started out copying a South Bend and in the end made our last ones for South Bend. 62 years between the first South Bend pattern and the last South Bend customer. The bookend is exact. The cast iron lineage that armed Australia in the Pacific War is, in 2001, packed into a wooden crate at Port Adelaide and shipped to Indiana. The Pacific, the lathes once defended, the lathes now crossed in reverse. By 2001, South Bend itself is a hollowed-out brand, sold and resold through the 1980s and 90s, eventually to LeBlond Maquino, then to other hands. Hercus's GS26-075 may have been one of the last all-Western pattern South Bend branded lathes built anywhere in the world. After 2001, no Hercus lathes are built in Australia. By 2005, all machine tool manufacturing at the Thebarton works has ceased. The relocation to Regency Park, which began in early 1993, is complete. Hercus the lathe-maker is finished. Hercus the gear cutter, the CNC machining firm, the gearbox refurbishment business. That company survives. It still trades today. A short tribal note on Adelaide industrial death in this period. 2005. The Mitsubishi engine plant at Lonsdale, also in Adelaide, closes. 650 jobs. 3 years later, on the 27th of March 2008, the last Australian-built Mitsubishi 380 rolls off the line at Tonsley Park. 930 workers. 9 years after that, on the 20th of October 2017, the last Australian-built Holden Commodore rolls off the line at Elizabeth, north of Adelaide, the South Australian industrial belt that fed Hercus's customer base for 80 years. Holden Woodville, GMH Elizabeth, Mitsubishi Lonsdale, Mitsubishi Tonsley, Whyalla Shipyards, the SA Railways at Islington went dark in the same generation. The last Hercus lathe was packed for Indiana. The factory floors that had bought Hercus lathes were closing. Both sides of the trade died together. Chapter 11. The Ghost Under the White Paint. Corner of Anderson Street and Stirling Street, Thebarton, today. A long brick industrial building, painted white. From the street it looks like any anonymous Adelaide warehouse. But step closer. Look at the brickwork above the cornice line. Look at where the paint is thinnest. 2 letters. Painted over but ghosting through. H.S. Hercus, Suffolk. That was the drawing office. Across the road 2 more buildings of the original work survive. A metalwork forums member with a camera walked the perimeter a few years ago and posted the photographs. The Anderson Street Works is gone as a factory. But the bones are there, the ghost signage. The bricks Fred Hercus laid out his floor on. The block where the surplus war lathes were stacked before they shipped to the Hendon Ammunition Works in 1942. Drive 9 kilometres north, 12 Canberra Street, Regency Park. A modern industrial estate, Hercus Proprietary Limited, 20 to 50 staff. The South Australian Business Chamber lists. Largest gear cutting division in South Australia. Fitting services and gearbox refurbishment up to 20 tonnes. Mining customers, steel customers, defence customers. The Mazak Integrex multitasking machine in the tool room. 23,000 lathes built in Adelaide between 1920 and 2001. Roughly 2,000 machines logged on Collector Mal's register today, 700 of those still turning in teaching institutions. 0 are still being built. Australia killed a lathe. Australia could not have done without. Sister stones across the country. Sidchrome, Australian mechanics tools made at West Heidelberg in Victoria, was sold to the Stanley Works in December 1991. Australian manufacturing of Sidchrome was fully shifted to Taiwan by 1996. Mitsubishi Tonslai, last car, 27th March 2008. The Tonsley site has, in one of the cruelest ironies in Australian industrial history, been redeveloped into a precinct that includes a TAFE campus. The same TAFE system whose workshop closures helped kill Hercus is now teaching on the floor where Mitsubishi died. Holden Elizabeth, last Commodore 20th October 2017. Ford Australia, last Falcon at Broadmeadows, 7th October 2016. Holden's Iron Lion engine at Fisherman's Bend, last build 28th June 1999, 9 dates, 85 years, 1920, F.W. Hercus founded Payneham Road, St. Peters. 1939. The Anderson Street Works, 1940, the Department of Munitions, the War Request. 1967, the Pinnacle. 199 staff. 1974, the Hercus 260, 25th May, 1988. The Senate Economic Statement, 1990. The Apprenticeship Peak, 161,000. 2001, the last Australian lathe, GS 26075 to South Bend. 8th April, 2008. John Button dies in Melbourne, age 74. Pancreatic cancer, a Geelong College old boy who supported the Geelong Cats his whole life. The man who sold off the Australian manufacturing tariff wall died in the same year Mitsubishi Tonsley closed in Adelaide, the city that had bought thousands of his country's lathes. 3 lessons from a killed lathe. Lesson 1. Capability is sovereignty. The country that cannot make its own machine tools cannot make its own weapons, its own engines, its own bridges. Australia knew this in 1940. Australia forgot it by 1988. The Hercus 9-inch was a copy of a South Bend, but it was an Australian copy, made by Australian hands in an Australian foundry. Capability does not have to be invented. It has to be kept. Lesson 2. Apprentices are a national asset. The Hercus lathe did not die because the lathe was bad. The Hercus lathe died because the country stopped training the people who would buy it. 161,000 apprentices in 1990. Half that number a decade later. No machine tool industry survives the disappearance of its customer base. The lathe followed the apprentice into the wreckage. Lesson 3. Some decisions cannot be reversed by the next election. The Economic Statement of 25th May 1988 was passed under Labor, extended under Labor, finalised under the Coalition. There was no major party defending the tariff wall by the late 1990s. Hercus could not vote its way back into a market. 12 years of bipartisan disarmament cannot be undone by a single political cycle. The country that votes to unmake its own industry will have to vote twice as hard and for twice as long to ever make it again. 23,000 built, 700 still teaching, 0 still being made. Australia killed a lathe. Australia could not have done without. The country didn't keep what it built.